why does it have to operate like it does? Only right because the government, as the apartheid government, refused to subsidize them, as they do other public transport. So they subsidize all the buses. You see the big, what's the big orange buses that drive, have been around?
The River.
Not the River. It's a private company. Big orange, they've now changed colour recently. They repainted their buses. There were these big orange buses. It's that big company. It's a big bus company, but many bus companies are sponsored, are subsidized by the state. But the taxi industry never was. And the post-apartheid government also doesn't subsidize them. Why? Because it's like, hey, save millions and millions of rand with this public transport system. But we just look the other way when you've got rampant. What's developed out of the taxi industry is a hit industry, a human hit squads.
What are those?
Assassination squads.
Oh, yes.
Assassination industry. You see KZN coming out of the hostels, all linked to the taxi industry. They've now taken over the construction industry as basically extortionists. So a whole sort of security thing. So many negative things are evolving out of the desperation for money, but the forces behind how many taxi bosses are shot and killed in competition. Countless. How many people have their cars bashed by taxis? The accident rate. How many people die in taxis every year? And it's because the state doesn't properly regulate it, because they know they can't, because they don't subsidize them to be able to say, look, you've got to replace your tires every 4 years. You've got to make sure your brakes are sorted. Yes, all those regulations exist, but they don't enforce them. How many times you drive on the road and taxis are blatantly breaking the law? The police just stand and watch. Because everyone knows that's the way they have to operate in order to survive. But it's all because the government saves huge amounts of money not subsidizing that industry. So, yeah, I mean, that's a difficult thing. So spatial justice, it's hard to argue that the taxi industry should continue to operate like it does. But we know they're forced to operate like that because they are left out of the state subsidy system. And so that's essentially the problem. And it's actually a legacy of apartheid, that the current state is sort of adopted quietly and left. So I would imagine some taxi industry argue that, hey, it's better like this because we don't have people looking over us, we don't have all these harsh regulations. But at the same time, it's really tough when the petrol price goes up and the tire price and the rand goes down, and they have to get even harder and they have to fight even harder for the taxi for the successful taxi routes. So you get more shootings, more pressure, and so on. And that's how it goes, But really, if you regulate it, you say, right, now you follow regulations, you pay taxes, but at the same time, we subsidize you. As any public transport system is subsidized all over the world, they are subsidized by the state. It's the nature of public transport. There are always routes that are not profitable, always. Especially in a country like South Africa with low densities, you're always going to have routes. So how do you get people to drive down the route that they know is not profitable? You give them a subsidy. Railways are subsidized. You cannot privatize the railways completely. They did it in England. What did England do? In no time at all, they had taken off a whole lot of routes. We just cancelled, we just stopped because they weren't profitable. Where's the public transport then? And those people who live on those routes have to buy private cars, etc., etc. Okay, so yeah, how do we then, where do we go with your topic? By the planning profession is that logically we say public transport needs to be mass public transport, metro rail, rapid bus. Look at the numbers of people in a rapid bus down here on Empire Road. Those articulated buses. If that's full, that's how many taxis in there alone? Maybe 6, 7 taxis?
No.
Full. on a dedicated lane, safe lane, no chance of, minimal chance of accidents, going at better speeds because they don't have the congestion. That's why a lot of the taxis take that lane in order to get around the congestion. So that is logically the best form of public transport. But in the absence of that, we rely on the taxi industry. So the challenge for planners is that because of certain historical, institutional structures or agreements, we've got to go for the second and third best, which is saying public transport in the form of minibus taxis. Again, everyone would like those taxis to be better regulated for safety purposes, mainly for safety purposes, for the people in those taxis. What you have is a tire blowout at 60 k's, 80 k's an hour, and the taxi whirs off the road. They've got no proper reinforcing on top, and so if they turn over, you just get serious injuries. So, the challenge is how do you get better public transit. So, if you look at the Rea Vaya, the taxi industry came out against it because it was fierce opposition. And what was the negotiated settlement was that the taxi industry would buy into the Rea Vaya, so they're part owners of the Rea Vaya. That was the way they got them to agree to it. Otherwise, they were going to say, no ways. We just will not allow you to build this thing. So it's to maybe the challenge is to begin to transform the industry. So in an ideal situation, you would have mass movement along the major corridors and major movement areas. And then in the smaller outlying areas, you would have subsidized taxi movement. That would be a more ideal, balanced public transport system. Where now we have taxis having to go long distances across the metro because there's no rail and there's inadequate buses. And so they have to travel long distances with only 16 to 20 people who are getting off and on. And the more they travel further out in that direction, the less people are going to get on. Because only when they start turning around and coming back will people start heading back into the city. So, it's just not profitable for them. So what do they have to do? They have to go quicker. So they have to race, they have to break the law. They have to drive around congestion wherever possible, if it means on the pavements and back roads. And you see them doing this, but in many respects because of necessity to make that number of routes, number of trips they have to do in order to cut a profit. That's always the challenge. And if your profit margins are really tight and you see that one of your tires is bald, you're going to say, well, let me wait another month, another 2 months before I replace it. And that might be fatal. You don't know. So, that's so the challenge for planners is how do you work within these parameters to try and improve and make a more efficient public transport system. And you understand what is the role of the minibus industry? Trying to close your thing. There we go. Okay. No, it's not a touch screen, eh? So let me get you there. There you go. In your understanding, what role has the minibus had, particularly in relation to creating social justice in the city? So it's had a huge contribution because it has remained the last remaining public transport that gets poor people around the city. So it's had this huge role, but at huge costs. So there's costs involved beyond the taxi industry into what's, as we just mentioned earlier, the security industry, extortion, all kinds of crime stuff has developed out of it. There's huge costs to safety. That's come at the cost of contributing to spatial justice actually in the city, but only in the absence of other better public transport systems. Yeah. How can spatial planning principles be applied to address issues of informality? So the complexity of your question there is that there's the institutional informality of the taxi industry. It's not spatial informality, it's institutional informality. It's the issue of not necessarily adhering to certain regulations, not paying certain taxes, those kinds of elements of informality or business informality, running a business informally. Spatial planning principles don't really apply to that.
Okay.
It's, you know, spatial planning principles relate to locality, where things are located, and so on, and accessibility. And we've explained how, in a sense, the informality of the industry in the current context enables them to provide access, which contributes to spatial justice in the city.
All right.